In our last video module, we reviewed some federal regulations which impact the practice of pharmacy. In this one, I want to take a more specific look at one in particular, and that's the Food and Drug Administration. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published a book called The Jungle. This is my copy of The Jungle here in front of me. It was a condemnation of the meat packing and processing industry around Chicago and really raised a lot of concerns about our meat processing in the United States, but really more so generally about our food safety. This prompted our Congress to pass what was called the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Isn't it interesting that a piece of literature led to a legislative change? I just think that's historically interesting. This group, which was originally called the Bureau of Chemistry in 1906, became known as FDA in 1930, originally had the oversight responsibility for misbranded or adulterated products. And we defined, remember, adulteration earlier in the course as using foreign or impure substances in a compound, usually to make money by using cheaper or inert products instead of the real thing. I want to tell you also that in 1912 there was an amendment to this Pure Food and Drug Act called the Shirley Amendment, which prohibited false or fraudulent claims about products. So you couldn't claim that this snake oil is going to cure all ills. You know, we had to be truthful in our advertising, if you want to put it that way. The problem with the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Shirley Amendment was that the government was responsible for proving something was wrong. It didn't require the people who were making the product to prove it. It required the government to prove something was inaccurate. So it really had very little teeth in this legislation. Well, here comes another disaster. In 1937, 83 people died in the United States from the use of a pharmaceutical solvent, diethylene glycol, in an elixir of sulfanilamide that was prepared and distributed across the country. This, again, like many public health disasters, led Congress to act. And subsequent to these 83 deaths in 1937, Congress passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. Now, this Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act required FDA to approve all new drugs before they go to market, as well as medical devices. And now the people who were bringing the product to market had to prove the safety of this product. So it really required new drugs to be approved and that they had to be proven safe. And very significantly required the people who were bringing them to market to make the proof that this was actually going to be safe for the public to use. I want to bring a couple of amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to your attention. In 1951, we had what was called the Durham-Humphrey Amendments. This piece of legislation was written by Representative Carl Durham from North Carolina and Senator Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota. Hubert Humphrey, you may remember, eventually became Vice President of the United States. And Hubert Humphrey was, in fact, a pharmacist. So he probably was the highest-ranking political figure that was a pharmacist in our country yet to date. The Durham-Humphrey amendments required FDA to designate an approved product that's going to go to market as either being a legend product, you see it's a pharmacy fundamental, meaning requiring a prescription, or is it over-the-counter? And OTC we defined earlier as obviously not requiring a prescription. So this amendment really designated us having to define a drug as being for prescription use only or over-the-counter. It's interesting to me that it was mid-20th century before this really came to be. Another significant amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act are called the Kefauver-Harris Amendments in 1962. These amendments gave the FDA much more teeth. They said that they now have more control over research and manufacturing, that we should be following good manufacturing procedures, for example. Gave FDA control over advertising of products. And very significantly required drugs to be proven effective before they went to market. Here again, isn't it kind of an interesting thing that it was 1962, really, before drugs had to be proven effective before they went onto the market? I just find that kind of an interesting fact. This amendment also provided for a thing called Drug Efficacy Study Implementation, or DESI. And this also provided the capability of taking some existing drugs that were on the market off the market if they were not shown to be effective. So subsequent to 1962, we had quite a few called DESI drugs which were removed from the market because they were no longer, they had not been shown to be effective. And then finally, here's another amendment to the Food and Drug Administration called the Food and Drug Administration Amendments in 2007, much more recent. And these amendments did three things. One, it gave the FDA authority to require post-approval studies and clinical trials. So you'll remember when we talked about drug discovery and development that we said FDA could require phase 4 testing for drugs even after they went to the market. This is from this amendment. Secondly, FDA received the authority to require REMS, which we learned about last week as well, risk evaluation and mitigation strategies. If we felt that this drug had value but had a high risk potential, we might bring REMS so that we could kind of control the use of that product and improve safety for patients. And then finally, these amendments provided FDA authority to preview direct-to-consumer advertising for pharmaceuticals that we see on television and in other print media. Our one pharmacy fundamental for this module is legend drug. And this means a drug which bears this legend: caution, federal law prohibits dispensing without a prescription. And here's the question I'd like you to think about in our discussion forums this week relating to this module. Public health disasters often lead to changes in legislation, as we've seen. Why haven't the data on the extent of adverse drug events prompted stronger legislative mandates for medication therapy management services? I think if the public understood the impact of adverse drug events, that there would be a cry for legislation that would help lead to better monitoring and control of medications. I'll see you next time.